It was a Wednesday evening when everything changed. I came home early from work, a rare occurrence, as my job usually consumed my entire day. As I walked in through the door, I could smell dinner cooking in the kitchen. The comforting scent of pasta sauce mixed with herbs filled the air. I was tired but happy to be home, eager to unwind and enjoy a quiet night with my family. My wife Sarah was standing by the stove, stirring the pot. She glanced over her shoulder and smiled at me. Her smile, the one I had known for 10 years, seemed warm and familiar, but there was something slightly off, a distance in her eyes I hadn't noticed before. I placed my briefcase on the table and sat down on the couch, my eyes scanning the room. That's when I saw it, her laptop, open on the kitchen counter. It wasn't unusual for her to leave it out, but something about it felt different today. It wasn't that I suspected anything, but I couldn't shake the urge to look. I had never been a man to pry into her personal life, but curiosity nagged at me. I got up and walked over to the laptop. Sarah hadn't logged out of her Facebook account. A wave of unease washed over me, but I shrugged it off. What could it hurt to glance at her messages? We were a married couple after all. I trusted her. But as my eyes scanned the screen, I felt something in my gut tighten. There, on the screen, was a conversation between Sarah and someone named John. I didn't know him, but that didn't concern me right away. What caught my attention was the intimacy of their messages. "I can't stop thinking about you. I miss the time we spent together last night," the message read. My heart stopped for a second. My eyes froze on the words. It didn't make sense. I leaned in closer, my pulse racing, and scrolled down to read more. The conversation became more flirtatious, the language more suggestive. Photos were exchanged, pictures that were far too intimate to be just friends. My hands trembled as I continued reading. This wasn't just a casual conversation. This was an affair. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. Everything that I thought I knew about my wife, about our marriage, crumbled in that instant. My mind raced as I scrolled through more messages. It wasn't just one meeting. They had been meeting for months. The most recent one had taken place just the previous weekend. I sat there, staring at the screen, unable to move. The weight of the betrayal crashed down on me. My mind was spinning, and I felt a cold sweat on my palms. I couldn't breathe. The woman I trusted more than anyone in this world had been lying to me, meeting someone else, and worse, keeping it hidden for so long. My stomach twisted with disbelief. How could she do this? Suddenly, I heard Sarah's voice from behind me. "Mark, are you okay?" I snapped the laptop shut, my heart pounding. My thoughts were racing, but there was no way to go back now. I had seen it, and I couldn't pretend that everything was normal. Without thinking, I turned around and faced her. My voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "Sarah, who is John?" She froze, her face going pale. Her eyes darted to the laptop, and I could see the panic in them. For a moment, she stood there, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to form words. She didn't speak right away, and that silence was like a knife twisting in my chest. I was struggling to keep my composure, but the pain was already overwhelming. "How long, Sarah? How long has this been going on?" Sarah's eyes welled up with tears. She shook her head, her voice trembling. "Mark, it's not what you think. It's complicated. Please, let me explain." But I couldn't just let her explain, not when I had seen the proof myself. The betrayal was too deep, too raw. My voice broke as I repeated, "How long?" Her silence spoke volumes. She knew that she had been caught, but even now, she tried to cover it up, to soften the truth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, barely above a whisper. "A few months. I never meant for it to go this far." I shook my head in disbelief, the words barely registering in my brain. A few months? This wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. She had chosen to do this. She had chosen him over me, and I couldn't understand why. Tears filled my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I'd always prided myself on being strong, on keeping it together no matter the circumstances. But now, I felt like a fool. I felt like I had been living in a lie for so long, and now that lie was shattered. "Mark, I am so sorry," she cried. "It was a mistake. I was lonely, and I didn't know how it got out of control. It was just a one-time thing at first. But then it became more. My mind couldn't process what she was saying. My heart was too broken. She had taken our marriage, our vows, and thrown them away. I had trusted her with everything, and now I was left here, alone with this mess. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," I said quietly, the pain in my voice palpable. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way." She reached out to me, but I recoiled, my emotions all over the place. "Please, Mark, I love you. I want to fix this. I'll do anything." But how could I believe her? How could I ever look at her and not remember the lies? The betrayal. She had shattered everything, and I wasn't sure if there was a way back from this. I left her standing there, her sobs echoing in my ears as I walked out of the room. I didn't know what I was supposed to do next. I didn't know if I could ever look at her again, without seeing the images of those messages. My life, our life, had been flipped upside down, and I didn't know how to get back to the person I was before. I sank into the couch, my mind reeling. What had I missed? How had I not seen the signs? The person I loved had betrayed me in a way I never could have imagined. The anger and hurt were suffocating, and for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure if we could ever recover from this. The days that followed were a blur. I could barely sleep, barely function. Every time I closed my eyes, the images of Sarah's messages flashed before me. The words, the pictures, the intimate conversations, they haunted me in the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts. I had never felt so betrayed, so utterly lost. The mornings were the worst. Waking up to the same routine, seeing Sarah's face across the breakfast table, but knowing everything had changed. She tried to act normal, to keep things as they had always been, but I could see the guilt in her eyes, the way she couldn't quite look me in the eye. Her apologies were endless, but they felt hollow. She'd sit next to me, pleading with me to listen, to understand that it wasn't just about the affair, that it was a symptom of deeper problems. But the more she spoke, the more the words seemed to lose their meaning. How could I listen to her? How could I trust anything she said? One night, after the kids had gone to bed, we sat in silence. I couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to hear her voice, but I knew she needed to talk. She needed to explain, even though nothing could explain what she had done. "Mark, please," she said, her voice shaky. "I know I've hurt you, and I can't take back what I did, but I want you to understand. I was so unhappy. I felt so alone for so long. You were always busy with work, and I was taking care of everything here. The kids, the house, and it just felt like you were so distant." I closed my eyes, trying to block out her words, trying to keep the anger inside, but it didn't work. The anger surged, and I found myself shouting, "So this is how you deal with it? You find someone else to fill the gap? You think this makes it better?" She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. I needed to vent the storm inside of me. "You can't just throw away 10 years like that," I continued, my voice breaking. "I gave you everything, Sarah. I loved you. I trusted you, and this is what you do?" The tears welled in her eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. The woman I had built a life with was a stranger now. How could I even look at her? She had taken everything, my trust, my faith in us, and shattered it beyond repair. "I didn't want this to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I was so lonely, Mark. I needed someone to talk to, someone to listen. I know it was wrong. I regret it every day." Her words felt empty. No matter how much she apologized, no matter how many times she begged for my forgiveness, I couldn't stop the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. One moment I was filled with blinding rage. The next I was paralyzed by sadness. I kept asking myself over and over how it could have happened. Was it something I did? Had I been neglectful? Had I failed her in some way? But then a voice in my head reminded me, this wasn't my fault. Infidelity is never the victim's fault. But that didn't stop the self-doubt from creeping in. What had I missed? Why hadn't I seen the signs? I turned to my friends for advice, but their responses only made things more confusing. Some told me to leave, that there was no going back from this kind of betrayal. Others said to try and work through it, that forgiveness was the only way to heal. Everyone had their own opinion, but no one could understand the pain I was feeling. The worst part was the guilt that followed. I had 2 young children to think about. They didn't know what was happening, but I could see the tension in the house, feel the weight of the unspoken words between Sarah and me. They were too young to understand what was going on, but they weren't blind. They knew something was wrong. One afternoon, as I watched Sarah playing with them, I was struck by the sharpest pain yet. She was still their mother, still the woman they loved. But to me, she was a stranger now, a woman who had betrayed me in the most intimate way, and yet she still wore the mask of the loving mother, trying to hold everything together. But I couldn't. I couldn't forget what I had seen, couldn't erase the image of her messages with John. And every time I looked at her, all I could see was the person who had lied to me, the person who had broken our vows, the person who had torn apart everything I thought was real. The days passed, and it felt like I was living in a fog. I was numb, trying to go through the motions of life, trying to pretend that everything was fine. But nothing was fine. Every interaction with Sarah felt forced. Every conversation seemed like a lie. And the worst part was the uncertainty. I didn't know what the future held. Didn't know if I could ever forgive her. Didn't know if I could ever trust her again. We spent our nights in silence, both of us too scared to speak the truth, too afraid of what might happen if we did. The weight of the betrayal hung in the air, like a dark cloud, suffocating everything around us. And yet, the love I once felt for her was still there, buried deep down. But love wasn't enough, not anymore. The days following that night became a blur of pain and confusion. Each day felt like a battle I wasn't prepared for. I was stuck in this emotional tornado, unable to find a way out. The house that had once felt like a home now felt like a prison. Every room was a reminder of the life we had built together, the life that was now shattered. I kept telling myself I had to stay strong for the kids. They deserved stability, even if I couldn't give it to myself. I didn't want them to see me fall apart, but it was impossible to hide the changes. Sarah and I barely spoke, only communicating when necessary. She tried to make things right, cooking dinner, helping with the kids, doing everything she could to act like nothing had happened. But I couldn't pretend. I couldn't ignore the gaping wound in my heart. One evening, as I sat in the living room, my thoughts weighed heavy on me. I had to make a decision, and I couldn't keep delaying it. There was a part of me that still wanted to save our marriage, wanted to believe that things could go back to the way they were. But deep down, I knew that wasn't realistic. The trust was gone, and no amount of apologies could fix that. The next day, after the kids had gone to school, Sarah and I sat down to talk. I wasn't sure what I expected from this conversation, but I knew I couldn't keep living in limbo. "I've been thinking a lot, Sarah," I began, my voice steady but filled with pain. "I don't know if I can do this anymore. I don't know if I can forgive you." She looked at me, tears already streaming down her face. "Mark, please, I'm so sorry. I know I've hurt you, and I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. I love you. I want to fix this. Please let me prove it to you." Her words were desperate, but they no longer held the weight they once did. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that things could go back to how they were, but in my heart, I knew I couldn't. Trust is something you can't just rebuild overnight, especially when it's been shattered so completely. "I want to believe you, Sarah," I said quietly, my voice breaking, "but I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can live with the constant reminders of what happened. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away, the distance between us growing wider with each passing day. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, but her apology felt like a distant echo. The reality of what had happened had set in, and there was no going back. We spent the next few weeks living in a kind of limbo, neither of us able to truly move on. The tension was unbearable. We both knew what needed to happen, but neither of us was ready to face it. The thought of separation terrified me, but I knew it was the only way forward. I spoke to a lawyer one afternoon, trying to understand my options. The thought of ending my marriage was overwhelming, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the only choice. I couldn't live in this constant state of pain, and neither could she. We both deserved more than this. I remember the day I finally told Sarah. The kids were at school, and the house was eerily quiet. I sat down across from her, my heart heavy with sorrow. "Sarah," I said softly, "I think it's time we separate. I can't keep doing this. We've both been through too much. I think we need to take a step back and figure out who we are, both as individuals and as parents." She looked at me, shock and devastation filling her eyes. "Please, Mark," she begged. "Please don't do this. I'll do anything. I love you. We can fix this." But I knew deep down that it was too late. The emotional damage was too much for me to overcome. I had tried to hold on, tried to believe that things could get better, but I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. We began the process of separation. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. There were arguments, tears, and countless moments of heartache, but despite all of it, we both knew it was the right decision. The love we had once shared was still there, but it had been tainted, and there was no going back. The hardest part was the kids. They didn't understand why their parents were suddenly living in two separate places. I tried my best to explain, to reassure them that everything would be okay, but the truth was, nothing would ever be the same. As time passed, Sarah began to distance herself from John, though I never truly asked about him again. I didn't need to. The affair was a chapter in our lives that was now closed, but the scars would remain. I threw myself into therapy, trying to work through the pain and the betrayal. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like I couldn't breathe, days when the weight of everything was too much to bear. But slowly, with time and support, I began to heal. I rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried for years, parts that had been lost in the routine of marriage and parenthood. Sarah, on the other hand, struggled. She regretted what she had done, but I could see that it was too late for her to undo the damage. She tried to repair her relationship with the kids, but the tension between us was always there, like an invisible wall. One afternoon, after the final divorce papers were signed, Sarah and I had one last conversation. It was a quiet, somber exchange. She asked for my forgiveness, but I was no longer angry. I'd learned to forgive, but I hadn't forgotten. "I'm sorry, Mark," she said softly, her voice filled with regret. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to destroy our family." "I know," I said, my voice steady but filled with sadness. But sometimes there's no going back. You can't just erase what happened. We both sat in silence for a while, the weight of our past hanging heavily between us. But in that moment, I found closure. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a quiet acceptance of the situation. As Sarah left, I turned to face the future. It was uncertain, filled with challenges and pain, but it was mine. I would rebuild, not just for myself, but for my children. And though the past would always be a part of me, I knew that I could move forward. I could heal, and I could find happiness again. Life doesn't always turn out the way we expect. Sometimes the people we love betray us in ways we can't imagine. But through the pain, we learn who we really are and what we truly deserve. And in the end, we learn that even after the most devastating betrayals, it's possible to move forward, to rebuild, and to find peace again.